The fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed like something dying. She stood at the admissions desk with one hand pressed flat against the cold laminate counter, the other hand pressed against her ribs, where the pain had been living for the past 3 hours. Not a dramatic pain, not a screaming pain, the quiet kind, the kind that waits. The nurse behind the desk did not look up. "A name?" the nurse said. It was not a question. It was the sound of someone who had asked the same thing 10,000 times and had long since stopped hearing the answers. "Elara Voss," she said. Her voice was steady. It always was. "Insurance." A pause, 1 second, 2. "I don't have any at the moment." Now the nurse looked up. That particular pause, that particular answer, had a way of changing the temperature of a room. The nurse's expression did not become cruel. It simply became distant, the way people's faces go when they have decided that a problem is not theirs to solve. "You'll need to speak with billing before we can. I'm having chest pains," Elara said, still steady, still quiet. "I've been having them for 3 hours. I drove myself here because there was no one else to call. I am not asking you to waive anything tonight. I am asking you to let someone look at me." The nurse held her gaze for a moment. Then she reached for a clipboard. "Fill this out. Sit in the blue chairs. Someone will call you." Elara took the clipboard. She walked to the blue chairs. She sat down and she pressed her hand back against her ribs, and she looked at the form in her lap, and for just a moment, one single private moment, her eyes went bright with something she refused to let fall. She filled out the form. She did not know that someone had already been called. She did not know that 2 floors above the city, in an office where the windows stretched from floor to ceiling and the night spread out below like a kingdom, a phone had rung. She did not know that the man who answered it had gone very still upon hearing what was said. She did not know that he had set down his glass of water with the particular care of someone controlling something much larger than the gesture suggested. She did not know any of this. She sat in the blue chair and she waited and she breathed through the quiet pain in her ribs. And she was entirely alone. And she had been entirely alone for so long that it had stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling simply like weather. His name was Nikolai Voss, and he was her husband. The hospital had a private wing that most people who visited sent. Aurelius Medical Center never saw. It was not advertised. It was not on any directory. It existed behind a set of frosted glass doors at the end of the 4th floor corridor, accessible only with a keycard that was issued to 11 people in the entire city, and Nikolai Voss held one. Of them, he arrived 2 minutes after the call. He did not come rushing. Men like Nikolai did not rush. He came the way a storm comes with complete certainty of its own arrival, preceded by a change in the air that made everyone around him straighten slightly without knowing why. He was 36 years old, dark hair cut close at the sides. A jaw that looked like it had been carved with something sharp and deliberate. His suit was charcoal gray, and it fit him the way expensive things fit men who were used to having the world adjusted to suit them rather than the other way around. He wore no tie. The top button of his shirt was undone. It was the only imprecision about him, and somehow it made him more formidable, not less, as though he had been too preoccupied with something important to bother. His eyes were the color of deep water, the kind you couldn't see the bottom of. His driver, Soren, walked half a step behind him and said nothing. His personal physician, a compact man named Dr. Hale, was already waiting at the frosted glass doors. She came in through the general admissions. "Doctor," Hale said quietly, falling into step beside Nikolai. "Chest pain, possible cardiac event. We don't know yet. She didn't use the card you provided her." Nikolai said nothing. "She listed no emergency contact. Still nothing. She's been sitting in the waiting area for, take me to her, doctor." Hale stopped speaking. He took them to her. She was still in the blue chair when Nikolai walked into the waiting area. She had the clipboard balanced on her knee, and she was looking at the far wall with the expression of someone who had learned to make their face very quiet. The waiting room was half full, a woman with a crying toddler, an elderly man with his eyes closed. a young couple speaking to each other in low, urgent tones. None of them looked up when Nikolai entered. Alara did not look up either, not at first. She felt the change in the room before she saw him. The way the air shifted, the way the noise seemed to pull back slightly, the way sounds do when something large and silent enters a space. She looked up, their eyes met across the waiting room. Neither of them moved. It had been 4 months since she had seen him. 4 months since the last conversation that had not been conducted entirely through lawyers and assistants and carefully worded emails that said everything except what either of them actually meant. 4 months of silence that had a shape to it, a weight, a specific temperature that she had learned to carry the way you learn to carry an old injury, by adjusting everything else around it. He looked exactly the same. Of course he did. Men like Nikolai Voss did not show what things cost them. She looked back down at the clipboard. He crossed the room in 12 steps. She counted them without meaning to. He stopped in front of her. She did not look up. Alara, one word, her name. In his mouth it had always sounded like something between a statement and a warning, and 4 months had not changed that. "I didn't call you," she said. "I know. Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her, that particular quality of attention he had, like a light you couldn't quite look directly into. "You are still my wife," he said. She looked up then. Her eyes were clear. That was the thing about Alara Voss. Her eyes were always clear, even when everything else inside her was anything but. It was the thing that had first made him notice her, 2 years ago at a function neither of them had wanted to attend. It was the thing that had, in his most honest moments, undone him completely. "In name only," she said. "That was the arrangement, he repeated, as though the word tasted like something he didn't recognize. "You are sitting in a hospital waiting room alone with chest pains, Alara. The arrangement can wait." She held his gaze for one long, still moment. Then she looked back down at the clipboard. "I've been waiting for 40 minutes. I imagine I can wait a little longer." He reached down and took the clipboard out of her hands. Gently, the gentleness was the part that surprised her. It always was, on the rare occasions it appeared. Like finding something warm in a cold room. "You won't be waiting any longer," he said. He turned and said something to Dr. Hale in a low voice. Dr. Hale nodded and moved toward the admissions desk. Within 90 seconds, a nurse was approaching them with an expression that had entirely transformed from the one Alara had received 45 minutes earlier. Alara stood. She did not thank him. He did not expect her to. They walked side by side down the corridor toward the private wing, and there was 12 inches of space between them, and in those 12 inches lived 4 months of silence and 2 years of a marriage that had never quite been a marriage, and something else beneath all of it that neither of them had ever found the language for, and perhaps, if they were honest, had never tried. Frosted glass doors opened. She walked through. He followed. And somewhere in the city behind them, in the particular way that things begin without announcing themselves, something that had been held very still for a very long time began, at last, to move. The private wing of St. Aurelius was a different world. The floors were pale marble, cool and hushed. The lighting was warm instead of fluorescent, the kind of light that felt deliberately human, as though someone had understood that illness was already cold enough without the hospital making it colder. There were no blue plastic chairs here, no clipboards, no nurses with distant eyes. There was only quiet and space, and the particular kind of order that exists when money has been applied to a problem with serious intent. Alara walked beside Nikolai and said nothing. She had always been good at silence. It was one of the first things he had noticed about her. Back when noticing things about her had still felt like a choice. Most people, when placed in silence with Nikolai Voss, filled it immediately. They talked. They explained themselves. They offered information he hadn't asked for, as though the quiet were an accusation they needed to defend against. Alara never did. She walked now with her hand no longer pressed to her ribs. Whether because the pain had eased or because she refused to show it in front of him, he couldn't be certain. Her chin was level. Her steps were measured. She was wearing a dark gray coat that was slightly too large for her, and her hair was pulled back with the kind of carelessness that only appears when a person has dressed alone, with no one watching, with no performance required. Something about that coat, that slightly, too large coat, pressed against something inside his chest that he chose not to examine. Dr. Hale led them into a private room at the end of the corridor. It was clean and calm, with a single window that looked out over the city. The city blazed below them, indifferent and magnificent. 100,000 lights that knew nothing about the two people standing at the edge of its skyline. "I'll need to run an EKG and some blood work," Dr. Hale said, his voice professional and careful. "It may be nothing cardiac, could be musculoskeletal, could be stress related, but we rule out the serious things first." Alara nodded. "I'll need a few minutes with the patient, Doctor," Hale added, looking at Nikolai with the polite but unmistakable meaning that only physicians deploy. The meaning that says, even to men like you, there are rooms you do not enter uninvited. Nikolai held the doctor's gaze for one beat longer than was comfortable. Then he turned and walked back into the corridor without a word, and the door closed behind him, and Alara was alone with the quiet and the warm light, and the city burning silently beyond the glass. She sat on the edge of the examination table. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. She breathed. Outside the door, she could hear nothing. No footsteps, no voice. But she knew, with the specific certainty of someone who has spent 2 years learning the weight of another person's presence, that he had not left, that he was standing just beyond that door in the corridor, in that particular stillness of his, waiting. She wasn't sure whether that made things better or worse. She decided it made things neither. It simply made things complicated, which was the only way things between them had ever been. Nikolai stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the middle distance, and his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was controlling something that wanted very much not to be controlled. Soren appeared at the end of the corridor. He was a large man, quiet in the way that large men sometimes are when they have learned that their size already speaks loudly enough. He had been with Nikolai for 9 years. He had seen things that most men never see and had processed them all with the same expression, which was to say, almost none. He stopped a few feet away and waited. "Find out who was on admissions when she came in," Nikolai said without turning his head. "Find out exactly how long she waited and what was said to her." Soren nodded. "And find out why the card I gave her wasn't used." Another nod. Soren understood, as he always did, that these were not questions being asked out of administrative curiosity. He disappeared back down the corridor without a sound. Nikolai turned to look at the closed door. He had received the call 47 minutes ago. His security team monitored the city's hospital systems not broadly, not invasively, but with specific flags attached to specific names. Alara's name was one of them. It had been one of them since the night, 8 months into their marriage, when she had come home from a gallery opening with a bruise on her wrist from where a business associate of his, a man who was no longer a business associate, and was, in fact, no longer very much of anything, had grabbed her. She had not told him about it. He had found out anyway. He had added her name to the monitoring list the following morning. He had told himself it was practical. He had told himself it was about liability, about the complexity of their arrangement, about the simple logic of keeping track of someone who bore his name and therefore, whether either of them wished it, bore a portion of his exposure. He had told himself many things. He looked at the closed door. He had not told himself, not once in all the months since she had moved her things out of the East Wing and into the residence on Callaway Street, the one he owned but had told his lawyers to transfer to her name quietly, without making it a negotiation, that the flag on her name in the monitoring system was anything other than practical. He told himself that now it didn't land the way it used to. The EKG took 11 minutes. The blood work was drawn by a nurse with gentle hands and a calm face who did not ask Alara unnecessary questions, which Alara was quietly grateful for. When it was done, Dr. Hale sat down across from her with the careful expression of a man about to deliver news that is not the worst news, but is not nothing. Your heart rhythm is normal, he said. No immediate cardiac event, but your blood pressure is elevated significantly, and you're showing markers of acute stress response. He paused. How long have you been under this level of stress, Mrs. Voss? Alara looked at the window. The city continued to burn below it, unconcerned. A while, she said. Are you sleeping? Some. Eating. She didn't answer that one. Doctor? Hale noted something on his tablet with the tact of a man who understood when silence was its own answer. I want to keep you overnight for observation, he said. Just as a precaution. Your body is telling you something, Mrs. Voss. The chest pain you experienced is a warning, not a crisis. Not tonight, but a warning that the current conditions are not sustainable. Alara looked back at him. I have work in the morning. I understand, but I'm not asking permission, she said. It was not unkind. It was simply true. I'm telling you, I have work in the morning and I live alone, and staying overnight in a hospital is not something I'm able to do right now. I will take whatever you prescribe. I will follow whatever instructions you give me, but I'm going home tonight, Doctor. Hale studied her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly, with the expression of a man who recognizes immovable things and has learned not to waste himself against them. I'll write you a prescription, he said, and a list of instructions, and I will want to see you back here in 48 hours. Agreed, Alara said. She slid off the examination table. She straightened her coat. She picked up her bag from the chair in the corner with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to keep their movements small and contained. As though taking up too much space had consequences, she walked to the door. She opened it. He was there. Of course he was. He was standing perhaps 4 feet from the door with his back against the corridor wall and his arms at his sides. And he looked up when the door opened, and for one unguarded fraction of a second, before the composure sealed back into place like water closing over a stone, something moved across his face that she had not seen before. She couldn't name it. She didn't try. Well, he said. The word was low and flat and gave nothing away. It's not my heart, she said. Stress response, elevated blood pressure, nothing dramatic. He held her gaze. Nothing dramatic, he repeated. Nothing dramatic, she confirmed. I'm going home. A pause. The corridor was very quiet around them. Somewhere distant, a monitor beeped in slow, steady rhythm, like a patient clock. I'll have Soren drive you, he said. That's not necessary. Alara, I took a cab here, she said. I'll take a cab home. I'm quite good at taking cabs, it turns out. I've had 4 months of practice. It was the closest thing to an edge she had allowed herself all evening. She watched it land, watched the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his jaw. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, without visible reaction, filing it somewhere internal where she would never see what it became. Then I'll walk you out, he said. She wanted to refuse. She considered it for 2 full seconds. Fine, she said. They walked back through the private wing in silence, the marble cool and quiet beneath their feet. They passed through the frosted glass doors. They walked the length of the 4th floor corridor. They took the elevator down together, standing on opposite sides of the elevator car with their eyes forward, and the distance between them was less than 6 feet and felt simultaneously like nothing and like an entire geography. The elevator doors opened. They crossed the lobby. The automatic doors of the hospital slid apart and the night air came in, cool and carrying the smell of rain somewhere distant, and they stepped out onto the pavement and stood side by side. And Alara pulled out her phone to call a car. There's something I need to tell you, Nikolai said. She looked up from her phone. His eyes were on the city, not on her. That was the thing about him when he was about to say something that mattered. He never looked directly at the person he was saying it to, as though the words were easier to release when aimed sideways. The divorce proceedings, he said. There's been a complication. The night air moved between them. She waited. He finally turned to look at her, and his expression was the one she had learned to be most cautious of. Not cold, not hard, but completely, carefully still. The expression of a man standing at the edge of something. he has not yet decided whether to step back from or into. Someone has filed a claim, he said, against the estate, against both of us. It goes back to before the marriage. Alara felt something shift beneath her feet, though the pavement didn't move. What kind of claim? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. The city hummed around them. A cab turned at the end of the block, its light yellow in the dark. The kind, he said quietly, that changes everything. She didn't sleep, not because of the chest pain, which had settled into something dull and manageable by the time the cab pulled up to the building on Callaway Street, not because of the prescription she had filled at the 24-hour pharmacy 2 blocks from home, the small orange bottle now sitting on her bathroom counter like a quiet accusation, not because of the city noise, which she had long since learned to sleep through, or the rain that had arrived sometime after midnight and was now pressing itself softly against the windows. She didn't sleep because of the word he had used, everything. She had turned it over for hours in the dark, lying on her back with her eyes on the ceiling and her hands flat at her sides. The way she slept when she was trying to make her body believe it was calmer than it was the kind of claim that changes everything. She had run through every possibility she could construct, every angle, every iteration of what that might mean in the specific context of Nikolai Voss and his world, which was a world of layers, of things beneath things, of surfaces that were never quite what they appeared. She had not come to a conclusion. She had, instead, come to the morning. The light came in gray and soft through the curtains she had chosen herself for these windows, pale linen. Nothing like the heavy architectural drapes in the house on Voss Towers, residential floors where she had lived for 14 months and always felt, somehow, like a guest in a museum. These curtains let the morning in gently. She had chosen them for exactly that reason. She got up at 6. She showered. She made coffee in the small, clean kitchen with the window that looked out over the courtyard, where a single tree was doing its quiet work of becoming green again after the winter. She drank the coffee standing up, which was a habit she had never been able to explain and had stopped trying to. At 6:47, her phone rang, not Nikolai, his assistant. A woman named Claire, who had the voice of someone perpetually managing 17 things simultaneously, and had, in Alara's experience, never once made a call that was purely social. Mrs. Voss, Claire said, Mr. Voss would like to meet this morning at the office, 10 o'clock if that works. Alara looked at the tree in the courtyard. Tell him, I have a meeting at 11 that I can't move, she said. He's aware. He said 10 o'clock would give you sufficient time. Of course he had checked her calendar. She did not know why this still surprised her, even faintly. In 2 years of marriage to Nikolai Voss, she had learned that very little happened within his perimeter without his awareness. It was not sinister, or at least, it had never felt sinister when directed at her. It was simply the way he moved through the world, with total informational command, as though uncertainty were a personal insult he had decided years ago not to tolerate. 10 o'clock, she said. Fine. She ended the call. She looked at the tree for another moment. Then she went to get dressed. Voss Tower was 40, 2 floors of steel and dark glass in the financial district. The kind of building that did not announce itself with anything as obvious as ostentation, but instead communicated its dominance through sheer, uncompromising verticality. It rose above everything around it with the patience of something that has never had to compete. The lobby was all pale stone and controlled light, and the staff moved through it with the particular efficiency of people who understood that their performance of calm was itself a form of power. Alara had walked through this lobby dozens of times. It had never felt comfortable. She had never expected it to. She gave her name at reception, her name, not his, which was a habit she had cultivated deliberately during the marriage and had not seen any reason to abandon now, and was taken up in the private elevator to the 42nd floor, which was the floor that did not appear on the standard directory and which housed only Nikolai's offices, his private meeting rooms, and the small, severe boardroom where she had once sat through a 4-hour meeting about acquisition strategy and had spent the entire time watching him run the room with a kind of controlled authority that was, she had admitted to herself only in the privacy of her own mind, one of the most compelling things she had ever witnessed. She did not think about that now. The elevator opened. His personal assistant, not Claire, who worked remotely, but Marcus, who existed physically in this space like a piece of very efficient furniture, looked up from his desk. "Mrs. Voss, he's expecting you. Go straight through." She went straight through. The office was large and spare and oriented almost entirely around the windows, which were the full height of the room and which offered a view of the city that on a clear day made the entire world below look like a model of itself. Today was not entirely clear. The rain had left a residue of gray in the air, and the city was muted, its edges softened. Nikolai was standing at the far window when she entered. He didn't turn immediately. She closed the door behind her and stood near it and waited, because she had learned that this was sometimes how he gathered himself, by giving the room a moment before he had to fill it. She had found it strange in the beginning. Later she had understood it was not rudeness. It was something more complicated than rudeness. He turned. He was wearing a dark suit today, almost black, with a white shirt and still no tie. She had noticed, over the years, that he almost never wore a tie inside his own spaces. Only in rooms where he was performing something for an audience. She had always found that small detail quietly revealing, though she had never told him so. "You look tired," he said. "Good morning to you too," she said. The corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a reaction. He moved away from the window and toward the low seating area to the left. 2 dark sofas facing each other across a coffee table, made of something pale and geological. He sat. He did not gesture for her to sit, because he never gestured. He simply occupied a space and trusted that the arrangement of it would communicate what he intended. She sat across from him. Between them on the table was a folder, dark gray, no label, the claim, he said without preamble. "I want to walk you through it before you hear it from anyone else. Who else would I hear it from?" He looked at her steadily. "The people who filed it are not people who prefer quiet resolutions. They will reach out to you directly if I don't move fast enough. I want you to be prepared for that." She held his gaze. "Who are they?" He leaned forward and opened the folder. Inside were documents, dense, formal, the kind that carried the particular weight of legal language applied to serious things. He turned them to face her. She looked down. She read the name at the top of the first page. The room went very quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a well-insulated office, 40. 2 floors above a city. Something deeper. The specific quiet that falls when something you believed was finished reaches back across time and puts its hand on your shoulder. "Harlan Voss," she said. The name came out flat and careful, the way you speak the name of something you're not sure is safe to say aloud. "My uncle," Nikolai said. "I know who he is." "Then you know what his involvement means." She looked up from the documents. Nikolai was watching her with that still, deep, water gaze, and she understood suddenly that whatever composure he was presenting right now was costing him something. She could not have explained how she knew. She simply knew, the way you know certain things about people you have been close to, not because they show you, but because proximity eventually teaches you to read the things they don't show. "He's claiming the marriage was a financial arrangement," she said slowly, reading further. "That the merger you structured 18 months ago, the Aldrin acquisition, was conditional on the marriage. That the marriage was legally a business instrument, and that because the terms of the acquisition agreement were subsequently altered without his knowledge, he has grounds to claim misrepresentation." She looked up. "He's trying to unwind the acquisition, yes. By proving our marriage was a contract rather than a union, yes." She set the documents down. Was it? The silence that followed was not empty. It was densely, specifically full. It was the kind of silence that has sharp edges. Nikolai did not look away from her. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said," she said, and her voice was quiet and level and entirely without heat, which somehow made it more precise. "Was our marriage a financial instrument? Because that depends, I would think, on what either of us believed it was when we entered into it. Alara. I'm asking you a direct question, Nikolai. I'd like a direct answer, for once. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that had been kept a long distance back from the surface. He held it there just behind the waterline, and she watched him hold it. And the room was so quiet she could hear the distant hum of the city below them. 40. 2 floors down, going about its business without any awareness of what was happening in this room. It was complicated, he said finally. That's not an answer. It is the only honest answer I can give you right now. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the documents again and continued reading, because that was the thing about Alara Voss. When she didn't get the answer she needed, she went looking for it herself rather than waiting for someone to hand it to her. She turned to the 3rd page. She stopped. She read a particular paragraph twice. Then she set the documents down again, and this time her hands were not quite as steady, and she did not try to hide that, because some things are too large to maintain perfect stillness in the face. There's a name here, she said, in the asset disclosure list. Nikolai said nothing. Mara Voss, she said. Date of birth listed as. She stopped. She looked up. Nikolai, who is Mara Voss. The silence that came now was different from all the silences before it. It was the silence of something that had been buried for a very long time, and had just been asked to come up into the light. Nikolai sat very still across from her, and for the first time in 2 years of knowing him, in 14 months of living in the same residence, in 4 months of separation, in all the controlled and loaded exchanges between them, she saw something in his face that she had never seen there before. Not coldness, not composure, something that looked terrifyingly like fear. That, he said very quietly, is what I needed to tell you. She stared at him. Outside the tall windows, the city moved below them, gray and vast and indifferent. And the rain began again softly, the way it does when it has decided it is going to stay. She did not move. That was the first thing. She did not move, did not lean back, did not put distance between herself and the document, the way most people instinctively do when something inside a page reaches out and strikes them. She sat very still with her hands in her lap and her eyes on his face, and the name hung in the air between them like smoke, Mara Voss, and she waited. He stood up. It was the first time she had seen him move without certainty. Every movement Nikolai Voss made was typically so deliberate it bordered on choreography. The economy of a man who had long ago decided that unnecessary motion was a form of vulnerability. But this movement was different. He stood, and he turned toward the window, and he put one hand against the glass, and she watched the line of his back, and she understood that she was watching him decide something. She gave him the time. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. Her name is Mara, he said, to the window, to the gray city beyond it. She is 4 years old. She lives with her maternal grandmother in a house in the north of the city, on a street called Elson Road. He paused. I have known about her for 14 months. Alara absorbed this. 14 months, she said. Her voice did not waver. It was a skill she had spent years building, and she was grateful for it now, in a way she had never been grateful for it before. We were married 14 months ago. Yes, so you knew before the wedding. A pause, very slight. I found out 3 days before. The rain moved against the glass. The city below continued its work. And you didn't tell me, she said. He turned from the window then. He turned and he looked at her, and his face was doing something she had no framework, for it was not cold, and it was not composed, and it was not the controlled blankness she had learned to read like a language over 2 years. It was something rawer than all of those things, something that sat closer to the surface than he usually permitted anything to sit, and it unsettled her more than anything he could have said. No, he said, I didn't tell you. Why? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he crossed back to the sofa and sat, not with the controlled ease of before, but with the slightly heavier movement of someone carrying more weight than they are showing. Because the arrangement had already been made, he said. Because the merger was 48 hours from signing. Because I had made a commitment and I did not yet know what the child meant, what it would mean for any of it. He paused again. And because telling you would have required me to explain things I was not prepared to explain. Things like what? things like her mother, she waited. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees, and it was such an uncharacteristically unguarded posture that she found herself momentarily unable to look away from it. He stared at the floor between his feet. Her name was Sarah, he said. We were together for 8 months, 4 years ago. It wasn't what you might think. It was not a grand thing. It was two people who were lonely in ways they couldn't articulate, and who misunderstood what the other was offering. He looked up at her briefly, and then back down. She ended it. I didn't fight that. And then she was gone, and I didn't look for her because I believed she didn't want to be found. And that belief, as it turned out, was something I should have questioned. She didn't tell you about the child. No, I found out through it doesn't matter how. The point is that I found out, and Sarah was already gone by then. A car accident, 14 months ago. His voice changed on those last 3 words, not dramatically, not by much, but enough, just enough. Mara was 3. She went to Sarah's mother. Alara looked at his hands. They were clasped loosely between his knees, and she could see the particular tension in them. The whiteness at the knuckles that was not quite visible unless you were looking closely, which she was. You've been supporting them, she said, financially, yes, and visiting. A pause that told her everything. I have been establishing that. It has been complicated. Sarah's mother is not, he stopped, chose different words. She does not trust me. She knew very little about me before Sarah's death, and what she has since learned has not made her more amenable. Because of who you are. Because of what I am. He corrected quietly, and it was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say, and it landed in the room with the weight of something he had never intended to put down in front of anyone. Alara sat with all of this. She sat with the image of a 3-year-old girl in a house on Elson Road. She sat with the knowledge of 14 months of carrying this alone, of walking through a wedding and a marriage and a separation with this specific weight always in his pocket. She sat with the fact that she had lived alongside this man for over a year and had known, in the way she always knew things, through the texture of silences, through the particular quality of his absences, through the moments when she had caught him looking at something she couldn't see, that there was a room inside him she had never been given access to. She understood now what room that had been. Harlan knows, she said. It was not a question. Harlan has known since before I did. He had people watching Sarah. He had been building this for a long time. The claim against the estate is not really about the acquisition. Acquisition is a vehicle, and Nikolai's voice was controlled now, back in the register of the man who manages crises for a living, but she could hear, beneath it, the other voice, the one that had spoken Sarah's name. He wants Mara declared a Voss heir. He wants to use her as leverage to challenge the succession structure of the company. If he can prove she exists and is legitimate and was deliberately concealed from family records, he has grounds to petition for restructuring. He's using a 4-year-old child as a legal instrument, Alara said. Yes, to get to you, to get to everything. She looked at the folder on the table between them. All those dense, careful words. All that legal architecture built around a little girl who lived on Elson Road and did not know that her name was being spoken in rooms like this one. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that takes inventory, the kind that, from Nikolai Voss, meant something, because he was not a man who looked at people with that kind of open attention, unless the moment had stripped away his ability to look any other way. The most straightforward resolution, he said carefully, legally the thing that most effectively neutralizes Harlan's claim, is if the marriage remains intact. The room became very still. If the divorce proceeds, he continued, Harlan's team will argue that the dissolution confirms the marriage was a contract rather than a union, a temporary arrangement, which lends credibility to everything else he's filing. His voice was level. If we remain married, if we can demonstrate continuity, stability, a functioning marriage, it collapses the central premise of his case. Alara looked at him steadily. You're asking me to pause the divorce. I'm asking you to consider it. For how long? Long enough to defeat the claim, months, perhaps 6. She said nothing. I know what I'm asking, he said, and then, in a voice that was quieter than the rest, I know what it costs. She stood up. She moved to the window he had been standing at earlier, and she put her eyes on the city, because sometimes the city was easier to look at than the thing in front of you. The rain had thickened. Below, umbrellas moved along the pavements like dark flowers opening. There's something you haven't asked me, she said. What's that? You haven't asked me how I feel about any of this, she paused. About finding out that my husband has a daughter I never knew about the fact that for 14 months I lived in that building and ate dinner across from you and attended your events and wore your name, and you were carrying this the entire time, and you chose every single day not to tell me. The silence that followed had a different quality to it than all the others. She heard him exhale behind her. No, he said, I haven't asked you that. Why not? Another silence. Longer, because I don't know, he said, that I have the right to ask. She turned from the window. He was looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that she had no framework for. And she understood now why he so rarely allowed it, because it was, on his face, genuinely devastating. It asked nothing and offered everything and made him look not like the man who ran this building and this empire and this carefully constructed world, but like someone much simpler and much more frightened than any of that. She picked up her bag from the sofa. I need to think, she said. I know. I need a few days. Take what you need. She walked toward the door. She put her hand on the handle. Nikolai, yes. She did not turn around. The little girl, Mara, she paused. Have you met her? The silence that came was the most complete silence of the entire morning. She could hear the rain against the glass. She could hear somewhere far below the muted sound of the city. She could hear her own heart, steadier than she expected it to be. Once, he said, 8 months ago for 11 minutes. Another pause. She has red paint on her shoes. She had been painting. She didn't want to stop when I arrived, so she kept painting while her grandmother introduced us. She didn't look at me for first 7 minutes, and then she looked up and she said, he stopped. Alara waited. She said, you have sad eyes. She said it exactly like that, very matter of fact, and then she went back to her painting. The door handle was cold under Alara's fingers. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the cold handle, and the room behind her containing a man she had spent 2 years both knowing and not knowing. And somewhere across the city, a 4-year-old girl with red paint on her shoes was living her morning in a house on Elson Road, entirely unaware that she was the still point around which several people's entire worlds were slowly turning. You have sad eyes. She opened the door. She walked out. She kept her face completely still all the way to the elevator, all the way down 42 floors, all the way through the pale stone lobby and out into the rain. She made it half a block before she stopped walking. She stood on the wet pavement with the rain coming down around her, and her umbrella still folded in her bag because she had forgotten it existed, and she pressed one hand against her sternum, not the chest pain which was gone, but something else, something that had no clinical name, and she breathed. A child with red paint on her shoes. 11 minutes. 8 months of knowing he had a daughter and choosing, every single morning, to carry it alone. She did not cry. She had decided sometime in the last hour that she was not yet certain what she was feeling, and she had a long-standing personal policy against crying over things she hadn't yet properly identified. It was not a cold policy. It was the policy of someone who had learned, the hard way, that some feelings are very large and need to be approached slowly, from a careful distance, before you let yourself all the way inside them. She put up her umbrella. She walked. She did not know as she walked that Nikolai was watching her from 42 floors above, his hand against the cold glass, his eyes following the small figure of her moving through the rain until she turned a corner and the city took her from his view. She did not know that after she turned that corner, he stood at the window for a very long time. She did not know that Marcus, who had worked for him for 6 years, and who had seen him in boardrooms and in crises and in the particular specific darkness that follows the death of someone who, whatever else they were, was the mother of your child. Marcus, who had seen all of that, walked in 12 minutes later to present an urgent document and found him still standing there, and set the document quietly on the table and walked back out without saying a word. She did not know any of this. But the city knew, the city always knows. It absorbs everything, the grief and the restraint and the love that doesn't yet know its love, into its stones and its rain, washed streets, and it keeps it all with the impersonal faithfulness of something very old and very patient. And somewhere on Elsin Road, a little girl was painting. She went to Elsin Road. She had not planned to. She had planned to go home to make more coffee, to sit at the small table by the window with the courtyard tree, and think through everything with the systematic, careful method she had developed over years of making difficult decisions alone. She had planned to make a list, actual paper, actual pen, the way she did when something was too large to hold entirely in her head. She had planned to be sensible. Instead, she found herself standing at the corner of Elsin Road at 11:30 on a gray Tuesday morning, with the rain reduced now to a fine mist that clung to her coat and her hair, looking at a row of modest, well-kept houses with small front gardens and painted gates, and she was not entirely sure how she had arrived here, except that her feet had made a decision her mind hadn't fully authorized yet. She did not go to the door. She stood at the corner and she looked at the houses, and she tried to work out which one it was. They were all quiet in the mid-morning way of residential streets, the particular hush of a street after the school run and before the afternoon, when the houses keep their business to themselves. There was a garden with a yellow gate 2 doors down that had in front of it a collection of ceramic pots painted in bright, uncoordinated colors. The kind of pots that are painted by small hands. She looked at those pots for a long time. She was not sure what she had come here to find. She was not sure she had come here to find anything. Sometimes when something is too large and too complicated and carries too much history, the only move available is to make it real, to stand in the physical fact of it, and let your body understand what your mind is still processing. She had learned this about herself years ago, after her mother died, when she had driven 3 hours to stand outside the house where her mother had grown up, a house she had never visited while her mother was alive because there had always been a reason not to go, and had stood there on the pavement feeling the specific grief of things left too late. She understood, standing at the corner of Elsin Road, that this was a different kind of grief, or perhaps the same kind, wearing different clothes. She turned to leave. The yellow gate opened. A woman came out, 60s, gray-haired, with the compact and purposeful build of someone who has decided that the world requires constant practical management and has organized herself accordingly. She was carrying a bag of recycling in one hand and a child's Wellington boot in the other, which she regarded with the mild exasperation of someone whose morning has already included several such inexplicable objects. Behind her, gripping the gatepost with one hand and leaning out at the particular bold angle of a child who is testing the precise boundaries of allowed freedom, was a small girl. She was wearing a yellow raincoat. Her hair was dark and unruly, and pulled into 2 uneven pigtails that suggested they had been done in a hurry or by someone who was very small. She was looking at the street with the total, unself-conscious absorption of a child who finds everything interesting. Her boots, bright red, pulled on with clear personal conviction, were visible beneath the hem of the raincoat. There was something on them, along the toe of the left one, a smear of color, red paint. Elara stood very still at the corner. The little girl's gaze traveled the street with the thoroughness of a small inspector, cataloging everything. A pigeon on the opposite pavement, a leaf moving in the gutter, a car parked at an angle that was apparently worth studying. And then her gaze arrived at Elara. She looked at Elara with the direct, uncomplicated attention that small children deploy before they learn to be circumspect about it. She looked at her for a full 4 seconds. Then she raised one hand in a wave that was both entirely casual and somehow ceremonious. Elara, before she had consciously decided to, raised her hand back. The grandmother had deposited the recycling by the gate and was now looking up. Her eyes found Elara, and they were not unfriendly, but they were not unguarded either. They were the eyes of a woman who has spent the past year learning to be careful about who comes near. Ilara turned and walked away. She walked 3 blocks before she found a coffee shop and went inside and sat at a corner table and stared at the cup of coffee she ordered and did not drink. The little girl had sad eyes. No, she hadn't. Her eyes had been bright and curious and entirely present. The eyes of a child who had not yet learned to carry anything heavy. It was Nikolai who had sad eyes. The child had said so. She had looked at him for 7 minutes, and then she had said it matter-of-factly while she was painting, and then she had gone back to her painting because she was 4 years old and she had said the true thing, and that was enough. Ilara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She thought about a man standing at a window 2 floors above the city, watching her walk away in the rain. She thought about 11 minutes in a house on this street 8 months ago. She thought about 14 months of silence, not the empty silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the full, heavy silence of someone who has too much to say and no idea, perhaps, how to begin. She took out her phone. She stared at his name in her contacts for a long moment. Then she put her phone away and drank her coffee. She needed more time. She did not have it. He came to Calloway Street that evening. She heard the car first, the particular sound of a very expensive engine doing something very quiet, which is somehow louder than an ordinary car because the quiet itself draws attention. She was in the kitchen when she heard it, making dinner with the systematic focus she applied to cooking when she was using it as a method of not thinking, chopping vegetables with more precision than the recipe required. She heard the car. She heard, a moment later, the intercom. She dried her hands. She pressed the button. She said nothing. "It's me," he said. She buzzed him up. She went back to the kitchen and continued chopping, because she needed her hands to be doing something, and because she was not ready to be standing in the middle of the room looking at nothing when he arrived, which felt too exposed, too much like the posture of someone who had been waiting. She had been waiting. She simply didn't want to look like it. He knocked. She called, "Come in." She had left the door unlocked, which was either an invitation or a practicality, and she was not prepared to examine which. He came in, and she heard him in the hallway, heard the controlled sound of his coat being removed with that characteristic economy of movement. And then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked different from this morning. Not less composed. Nikolai Voss was never less composed, but differently composed, as though the architecture had shifted slightly. He had undone a second button. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there, or had not been visible at 10 o'clock. "I'm making dinner," she said. "I see that. I haven't decided whether there's enough for 2. Something crossed his face. "I'm not here to eat. I know why you're here." She set down the knife and turned to face him fully. "I went to Elson Road today. The stillness that came over him was absolute. I didn't go to the door," she said quickly. I didn't plan to go at all. I just found myself there. I saw her from the street just for a moment." She paused. She waved at me. He said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet, the cutting board, the smell of onion and garlic. The small window above the sink with the evening pressing against it. The city going amber in the early dark. "She looks like you," Ilara said, around the eyes. He turned away from her. He put one hand on the counter and stood there with his back half turned and his head slightly down, and she watched the line of his shoulders and she watched him breathe. And this was one of the silence scenes, one of the ones that needed no explanation and received none, just 2 people in a kitchen and the weight of everything passing between them like current. He turned back. "I spoke to my lawyers this afternoon," he said. His voice was controlled, but it was the control of someone exerting real effort. "About Harlan, about the claim, about the options. And there is another option besides the one I presented to you this morning." He met her eyes. "I can fight it without the marriage. It will be longer, more expensive, more exposed. Mara's existence will become public during litigation. Her grandmother will be subjected to it. It will be..." He paused. "It will be ugly, and there is a real chance, not a certainty, but a real chance, that Harlan wins enough ground to damage the company significantly. But," she said, "but it doesn't require you to give anything more than you have already given." His voice was quiet and very direct. "I am aware of what I asked you this morning. I am aware of what it was to ask it. And I want you to know that if you say no, if you say that you have given enough and you want your life back, and you want the divorce to proceed, I will not fight that. I will not make it difficult. The house on Callaway Street is already yours. Everything we agreed in the initial settlement stands. She looked at him for a long time. Why are you telling me this now? She said. You could have just waited for my answer, waited to see what I decided. Because this morning I asked you from a position of need, he said, and I should have also asked from a position of honesty. She waited. He looked at her with those deep, water eyes, and something in them was closer to the surface than she had ever seen it. Something that had been living at depth for a very long time and was making. She understood a careful and deliberate decision to rise. The marriage was not only an arrangement, he said. Not for me, not from, he stopped, rebuilt, not from very early on. The words entered the room and stayed there. She felt something shift inside her chest, not the pain from last night, nothing clinical, nothing that required a prescription. Something older and more fundamental than that. Something that had been sitting in a specific locked place for a long time and had just heard from the outside a sound it recognized. Nikolai, she said, you don't have to. Stop, she said. Stop managing it, just. She pressed her hand flat against the counter beside her, steadying herself. Just stop managing it for 1 minute. He stopped. The kitchen held them both. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had not allowed herself to look at him in 4 months, in perhaps longer than 4 months, in perhaps the entire length of a marriage that had been described to the world as practical and had been, beneath that description, something she had never been brave enough to name. I know, she said. I know it wasn't only an arrangement. I knew that before you walked into that hospital last night. I knew it before the separation. I have known it for, she stopped. It doesn't matter how long. It matters to me. I know that too. The silence that followed was not like the others. It was not loaded with conflict or fear, or the specific tension of two people fighting not to reveal something. It was the silence that comes after something has been said for the first time, the silence of a room that has just changed its shape and is settling into the new configuration. She crossed the kitchen. She stopped in front of him. He was very still. He looked at her the way she imagined he had looked at very few things in his life, with his defenses simply not present, with no architecture between himself and the moment, with the totality of his attention as a form of surrender. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. His eyes closed. Just for a second, just the 1 second of it, her hand against his jaw and his eyes closed, and all that ferocious, controlled stillness briefly, privately, coming undone. Then they opened. I have a condition, she said. Tell me, Mara. Her thumb moved the smallest movement against the line of his jaw. If I stay, if we do this, and we fight Harlan, and we go back to whatever this marriage actually is, she is part of it, not hidden, not managed from a distance, not handled through intermediaries and scheduled visits that you approach like business meetings. She held his gaze. She's your daughter, and she told you the truth about yourself in 7 minutes when you'd known her for 7 minutes. That tells me she's extraordinary, and extraordinary children deserve more than 11 minutes. Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, not with any of the outward signs that breaking usually implies. It was quiet. It was a single, almost invisible fracture in the surface of him, and through it came something so unguarded and so purely human that she felt the air go out of her lungs. He reached up and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm. He held her hand against his jaw with the specific careful pressure of someone holding something they are terrified of dropping. Okay, he said. The word was barely above a breath. Okay, she said back. They stood like that in the kitchen for a long moment, and outside the city moved through its amber evening, and somewhere across the city a little girl with red paint on her shoes was being read to, or was painting, or was looking at something with those direct and truth, telling eyes, entirely unaware that two people were standing in a kitchen on Callaway Street and making, with one word between them, a decision that was going to change everything, and then Nikolai Voss, who did not smile, who had not smiled, really smiled, in longer than he could accurately remember, smiled. It was small. It was brief. It was the kind of smile that appears when a person has forgotten they know how, and is surprised to find the muscle memory still there. She saw it. She looked at it for one moment with an expression she did not try to control. Then she turned back to the counter. "There is enough for two," she said. He didn't say anything, but she heard him move, heard the quiet, deliberate sound of him settling into the kitchen, into the space, into the ordinary domestic fact of being somewhere as though he belonged there, and she kept her eyes on the cutting board, and she let herself, privately and completely, feel the full weight of what had just happened,